Good morning, everyone. Happy Sabbath. You can finally say happy Sabbath, happy day. I don't know if I said. Sorry for we're starting late. Let's open with a word of prayer. Our dear loving God, we thank you for bringing us safely through this camp meeting to this day. We thank you for the Sabbath and the rest and refreshing that we expect to receive. We thank you for your presence with us. And we pray now that we would have clarity on these topics, that we would understand the nature of the seventh kingdom and what's happening in our history. We thank you for your Holy Spirit now teaching and guiding us. In Jesus' name, amen. So I got some feedback from that my last presentation was really fast and lots of information. So I just wanted to give a quick overview to try and keep it really simple before we carry on. So we're looking at the Sunday law, and we're seeking to understand the Sunday law in our history and how we shifted our position on the Sunday law. So in essence, before we had a big focus on the religious side of the Sunday law test, whilst we recognized that it was also going to be a state, that church and state were going to come together and that politics would be involved. Our focus was very much on the religious church side of that and the fact that we would be tested as a religious group individually. So a religious group, but individually. So then we've moved now in from the personal to political. We've recognized that we need to focus on the state part of the test and understand what led America as an institution from the two ships to change its behavior from lamb to dragon. So that's simply what we've been doing. So we looked at the fact that we're focusing now on politics because we recognize that the world has changed and that this is much bigger than just apostate Christianity, that it includes a culture that is essentially patriarchal and anti-God. We've looked at men's rights activists. We've looked at different groups who are against equality in essence, or that it's much bigger, and atheism is much bigger than just apostate Protestants. So we recognize that we have to embrace the whole culture of America particularly to understand where the politics has gone and what the test is. So we recognized that it's equality, and we then started looking at and tracing, I guess we talked about radical feminism and human rights and loving our neighbor, and recognizing that the test wasn't going to be about Sabbath and Sunday, but about those topics, and that perhaps it always was. So we spoke about A.T. Jones in the classes, and how A.T. Jones saw that it was a human rights issue, not just about Sabbath and Sunday. In fact, it wasn't really about Sabbath and Sunday. So that's in essence what we've seen with the Sunday law. So now we're looking at the ship, the USA as an institution, and we're seeing how did this ship go off course? How did we get here today? What changes have happened that make this, that the country of America or the nation of America move from lamb-like to dragon? And so that's more of what I'm going to be doing today. We started touching on that yesterday, last class, by looking at how democracies die. And what did we say were the two main factors with how democracies die? What were the two important principles that were needed to be there to preserve democracy? Can anybody remember? So this is what the author had brought out as seeing was essential to the way the government operates in order to preserve democracy. What were they? Anybody? Faith, can you remember? Yes, so that's the that's the, I guess, the preserving the unwritten rules of democracy. So it's behaving in a certain way which is not legislated in law per se, in the Constitution, for instance, but there's an understanding that we need to behave this way and not breaking those unwritten rules. What were the two kind of unwritten principles or things that we wrote down? Do you remember one of them? Forbearance. Yeah, so we had forbearance. And right, Shadrach, sorry. Mutual tolerance. And what that does is it prevents what? If they have that towards each other, it prevents what kind of spirit? So they're basically saying that whatever we believe, so we've got Democrats and Republicans, whatever the Democrats believe and the Republicans believe differently, they're still going to work together. They're going to mutually tolerate each other and I guess be diplomatic with each other. They're going to work together to sort the problem out. They're not going to start firing shots at each other. So what's the opposite of that? What's the spirit that's created? Elsa, what are you going to say? No? Sabina? The spirit of seeing one another as enemies. What do we call that? Intolerance, yeah, intolerance. But they say it's a something spirit with the parties. They won't work together. What do we call that? They get entrenched in their side. Julie? Partisan. So if you don't have this, it's a partisan spirit. So when they say, you'll hear this said in news articles, that the opposite of that is a partisan spirit where both parties take their position and are entrenched in and refuse to move. And what that does is it leads them to vote for the party instead of the good of the country and the Constitution. And that's essentially the difference. So when they say before this, when they say bipartisan spirit, it means two-party spirit. It means that they're both working together. So there's this bipartisan spirit. So there was an understanding before Trump, basically, that the government worked on a bipartisan level, which means that both parties, the two, would work together to solve issues. So that even if there was an issue that is essentially something that the Democrat Party would take a stand on one way, if they saw that that was against the Constitution or against the principles of America, an unwritten code of how we behave, they would vote against it, even if it meant voting with a Republican. So before you'd get this cross-party voting, so that Republicans and Democrats would vote together on issues. But gradually, as they became more polarized, and we talk about polarization, the North and South Pole, as they both got towards further apart towards either pole, that's polarization, they became partisan. So now we're Democrats and Republicans, and we're not going to work together. There was one other thing we said before this happens that allowed Trump to rise up. So basically the Republican Party begins to change and becomes partisan in its spirit. But before that happens, you've got public disaffection. So there's already a problem in society. So that then is fueled or bought into. They take advantage of that situation. Instead of working together to try and get rid of the public disaffection, they then start to polarize and take advantage of that. So there was economic instability in America. People are upset about US intervention in other foreign countries, wasting money on the military going abroad. So people are already feeling those things so we've got to find someone to blame for the fact that we're in trouble economically. So maybe it's because we're spending too much money on helping other people. So that narrative was there already, for instance, as an example. And then Trump comes along and says, I'll stop that, I'll change it. And the people go, yes, we need a savior from these problems. So there's already this public disaffection, and then that led to the breakdown of working together. And this is how, and then a populace rises up to save the day, like a superhero, really. And people go for it because they're disgruntled already. So we talked about that, how democracies die. And then we started looking at 1898. I think before that, we looked at 2014 to see how the Republican Party began to change in 2014. And we highlighted the three things that were kind of relevant to that narrative. And that was, remember what they were? What were the three things we highlighted in 2014? Purging the party of moderates. So we want to get rid of people that are central in a center in their view of politics of right wing. We want to put the far right people in place. And the second thing, Jackie, remember? What are the three things in 2014? So we've got the purging of the Republican Party. What else did they do? What did Mitch McConnell do? Blocked the appointment of Supreme Court judges. Yeah. So there was that stacking the Supreme Court with far right judges. And then, so he started that by blocking it in that history. And then the third thing was Hobby Lobby. So we had this court case, which was essentially about reproductive rights and access to contraception, which showed how the Supreme Court was going to lean when it came to that. And it took a religious stance on it. And so we saw the beginnings of church and state coming together there in the way they made that decision, that the ideology was going to shape the court's decisions. So those are three key things that were happening in 2014 as the pre-Sunday law to show us this is what the Sunday law is about. It's this erosion of the Republican Party, which is going to lead to America not being democratic anymore, not behaving democratically. So we then put this date, 1898. So I just wanted to, and this is 126 years before 2024. So we use this to show that as there's lots of numbers we link to the 2520. The Elder Test did a structure with different numbers pointing back to different dates to support a prophetic date now. And I think Curtis used this first, that 126 years before 2024, so before Trump takes the leadership of the Republican Party, that the shape of America is changing. And Trump had already begun to change the shape in his first term. And him getting in is significant. He's going to continue those policies to reshape America. So in 1898, what we see is, this is about 100 years after America has established the Constitution, that up to that point, it's basically a few colonies coming together to form a new nation, we could say, but it hasn't got world power. It hasn't got any significant impact on the world stage. You'd probably say still that France, England, Spain, who have been colonizing the world, have got the power. Europe's still where the power base is. So what we can mark here from secular sources is that it's in 1898 that America begins to become a superpower. And what superpower means is a birth of a superpower. So they said that America had grown in isolation for many years, dealing with issues in the US. But when we get to 1898, we get the war with Spain over Cuba. And that means that the US now starts to get involved on a world level. So before they were very isolationist, that was just about them because they didn't have the military strength. They didn't have the capability to assert world dominance. But now they start to enter the scene and become a superpower, having power around the world and not just in America. So I think we quoted from a Vox article, if there was a single moment when US became a superpower, it was the war with Spain. The war shifted America's focus. From here on, it became this imperial power. Spain had been the dominant power in the Americas. So South America and all the outlying islands of the Americas, North and South America. Spain before had been the dominant power in all the outlying areas. And now with Cuba, there was this warfare about Cuba wanted to become independent from Spain. So America says, we'll help you. But really, America is also protecting its own interests and wants to push Spain away from the whole of the Americas. So and A.T. Jones comments on this, saying that it was also their wrong ideas of nationalism that wanted them to Christianize the world, because Spain was Catholic and they wanted to make it Protestant. So there was a push for that as well, this false patriotism to conquer other places and send missionaries to them. But this also, so it says, victory in the Spanish-American War transformed the United States, a former colony. So it was before a colony in the sense that it was ruled by Britain, and Britain had, I guess, established government over America, and then they had the independence, and they then become now an imperial power. So there's this shift from being a colony in itself to becoming an imperial power in its own right. And that was significant. I just wanted to put the Monroe Doctrine in here as well, because you might hear people talking about this, and I'm trying to keep it as simple as I can. But the Monroe Doctrine, in essence, it was evoked in this time period in 1898, although it was established in 1823 by James Monroe, who was the president at the time, who was trying to, basically they were opposed. It was a United States foreign policy position that opposed European colonization. So what that means is does anyone know what colonization means? Simple definition. I've got it here somewhere, I think. What does it mean, colonization? Anybody want to try? Quito, yeah, go on. To take control of a region or a place. So when you're colonizing, you send your people into the place, you take over, you put your government in place. So this is essentially, it's very aggressive. So you want to expand your territory, you want to have world dominion. So you go into a country, take over, take its resources, rule its people, perhaps enslave them in some way. Sometimes you may say you're training or educating them to live a better life, to like this whole idea that before the people were uneducated barbarians, and then somehow civilization has to go in and change things. And so it's very aggressive in its foreign policy that they're going to spread around the world and take control of these countries. So the difference between colonization, it's basically the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. So this is not friendly. This is very domineering and aggressive. So you go in and you take over the country, you put your government in place and your people, and you exploit it economically. So you basically rape it of its goods. And this is why, and America saw that was a bad idea, that we shouldn't be behaving like that, because they had felt that oppression of England, and I think also they wanted to secure their position in the world field. So there was some selfish interest in there. So they had this Monroe Doctrine, which basically opposed Europe from coming and taking any more territory anywhere and keeping the status quo. It holds that any intervention in the political affairs of the Americas by foreign powers is a potentially hostile act against the United States. So, so that then if Spain or France or England was going to up their game and start attacking American soil in any way, or taking on more power in the places where they had already colonized, America said, no, that's not in our interest. We're going to fight back for that, protect our interests. So it was essentially a protection thing. It wasn't an aggressive thing. This time period now, they evoke the Monroe Doctrine and they use that to say, look, Cuba's, wants its independence. You need to honor that. You need to get rid of this colonialized government over Cuba. But this strategy of stopping Europe do anything illegal, I guess, by America, and essentially it was a good thing, and to deter abuse of power on a more international level. And after 1898, the Monroe Doctrine was interpreted by lawyers and intellectuals as promoting multilateralism and non-intervention. So people saw the Monroe Doctrine as a positive thing to get countries to work together rather than one be dominant. Multi means lots of countries, multilateral. So they're going to behave in a way that's conducive to the collective, so that everybody's interests are going to be taken into account. And non-intervention, we're not going to go and intervene in other people's political situations. We're going to leave it as it is. We're not going to aggressively go in and say, we're taking over this country now from someone else. So it was a very, it's essentially good thing. But what people are doing now is when people use this to justify aggressive action. So they say, for instance, like George Bush with Iraq, I don't know if he did the Monroe Doctrine, but they reference this and say, we need to protect America's interests and we need to stop other people doing naughty things. So we'll go in and attack this country. And it's a justification for aggressive action. And it was never meant to be used in that way. So is in this history that they invoked the Monroe Doctrine in the Venezuela crisis. So there's a Venezuela crisis in 1898. So here we have the war with Spain over Cuba. And then the second thing that happens is this Venezuela crisis, which has been brewing through the 1890s. It's quite interesting. I think it's Venezuela when you see what Trump's doing with Venezuela. It's called Venezuela. Crisis. So I don't want to go too much into that, but these two things basically show that America is now flexing its muscle on the world stage. It says, so up to this point, up to the 1890s, America, from the Monroe Doctrine, was in 1823. But from there, the European powers hadn't taken it too seriously, that America's saying, we're not going to let you do any more damage or take over any more territory. They didn't take it seriously because America didn't have an army to defend itself. It didn't have any, and it wasn't that strong economically. So they didn't see it as any kind of threat. But in this history now, in 1898, America starts to become, as I say, more of a threat. So because the US lacked both a credible navy and an army at the time of this doctrine's proclamation, it was largely disregarded by the colonial powers. So France, Spain, England, they said, we're not bothered about this. But by the end of the 19th century now, with this crisis and the war with Spain, it changes. So the Venezuelan crisis of 1895 occurred over Venezuela's long-standing dispute with Great Britain about the territory. So Venezuela is a colony of Britain at this point, and they're arguing over territory, what belongs to Venezuela and what belongs to Britain. It becomes acute because there's a development of gold mining in the region. So we can see this is highly economically motivated, that they're important because they have gold. By 1898, the crisis ultimately saw Britain accept the United States' intervention in the dispute to force arbitration of the entire disputed territory. So you've got basically Venezuela versus Britain, and USA steps in to arbitrate. And Britain lets them do that. In the past, they might have said, well, who are you to get involved in this? Just stay away. But now they're listening, and USA steps in to arbitrate the crisis and tacitly accept the US right to intervene under the Monroe Doctrine. So they recognize the Monroe Doctrine now and say that America has a right, because it's dominant in that region, to intervene. A tribunal convenes in Paris in 1898 to decide the matter and award the bulk of the disputed territory to British Guiana. So they basically settle that through this Paris Agreement, which happens in 1898. So what that does, in essence, as we've said already, it shifts the USA from being just a colonial small state in itself, I guess, to a superpower. So now it's got a voice on the world stage. Various presidents came after that. Obviously, this is 1898, just before 1900s. And what happens now in the 1900s to, I guess, enforce that position of America having some part to play on a world scale? What happens in the first half of the 1900s? And we know, we've been talking about it in this now movement. Two significant events in the first part from 1900s to 1950. What are we saying happens? World War I and World War II. So we get World War I and World War II, where we see that United States intervention, I guess, helps determine the outcomes of the wars. So they've got that position in the world now to have influence on a world scale. After World War II, what we see now is more of a cohesion of the powers coming together to work together, because nobody wants World War II, World War III. Nobody wants another world war. After these two world wars, everybody in Europe and even in America is saying, let's work together to prevent that from happening. So from World War II and up to now, up to a Trump administration, the world has formed alliances and basically loosely come together to work together diplomatically using diplomacy and agreements to prevent a world war happening again. So everybody was bought into that narrative. So what I want to do now is just hopefully simply give an overview of how America has shifted its position in the way it interacts on the world scale, on the world field. So this is taken from an article called Information in an Information Warfare magazine. It's called Information Warfare Magazine, which I thought was interesting, from April this year. And it says, analysis of US foreign policy shifts between the pre-Trump and post-Trump eras. So what we want to do is we want to look at foreign policy. So this is how America, we can also touch on domestic policy. Domestic is internal to the country. Foreign is how the country interacts with other nations. So we want to look at foreign policy of America before and after Trump. Because this tells us how America interacted on the world field. And because in our history, we're trying to understand the Seventh Kingdom. So this is what this is all about, the Seventh Kingdom and its interaction as a dragon on the world's, not just in America internally, but externally, because we saw that first of all, the Seventh Kingdom takes over the Glorious Land. The King of the North enters the Glorious Land. And now we're in a time period where it's escalating to Egypt, the world. So that's how we need to see how has the administration changed from being lamb-like in its interaction with other nations to being dragon-like. So I'm just going to give highlights from this. For over 7 decades after World War II, US foreign policy was grounded in a broad consensus about America's role in the world. So it's telling us that from World War II up until 7 decades later, so around 2010, before Trump came in, basically 2016, before up to 2010 time period, that the US had a broad understanding, whether you were Democrat or Republican, that foreign policy was grounded in the understanding of America's role, what America was supposed to do. Washington was the principal architect and guarantee of the liberal international order. So there was a liberal international order. Essentially, and America was the architect or helped to build that international order and guarantee of it. So they basically protected and defended it. When we look at the ship of Alexandria, this was the work of America, was to establish in the world a place of protection and defense to preserve peace in the world. And they did that by building alliances and institutions to advance Western security and prosperity. So their interest was not just American, it was the whole of the West, so Europe included, and the more economically prosperous nations, to build alliances and institutions to advance those principles of security and prosperity. So they wanted to advance on an international level, security or peace and safety, you could say, security and prosperity. And there are several things that we could list as to how they did that. So first of all, they promoted democracy. And diplomacy. And what that means is they promoted democracy. They worked with other nations who they saw were democratic and had good governments, essentially, who treated their citizens correctly. So they would work with other European nations and allies to establish this world order on a secure and prosperous basis. And diplomacy. So if they did have disagreements with other nations, they didn't just barge in there and say, you will do what I say. They said, let's sit down and talk about it. So even with Russia, China, nations they really didn't agree with, there was this spirit of cooperation where we can't just go in there and do what we want and dictate the terms. Let's sit down and try and discuss this. So what we can see really is that the external affairs of America reflects their internal policy. So their internal policy is we mutually tolerate and forbear each other. We have a bipartisan spirit, a spirit of working together across parties. And it was the same in the world. If we don't agree with you, we're going to be diplomatic and try and do this tactfully and reasonably. And we're going to work with you to sort the problem and we're going to promote these principles in the world on a world scale like we do internally. They were multilateral, and we know these terms in the message quite well. So there's multilateral and unilateral, but multilateral means multi or many. So they were going to work with many countries and promote that harmony between the countries. They were not defending their own interests primarily. Uni meaning one, unilateral meaning the focus on one country only, often at the expense of other countries. So they would multilaterally work together, which means there were agreements and participation of many countries. So this is agreements with and participation. So there were multiple peace deals with different nations, participation with many nations. So basically that means that America worked with its allies. It would cooperate with them, they would help each other. And there were exceptions to that through the years, but generally speaking, the rules of engagement remained the same. So we've got the exceptions like Bush invading Iraq against the UN Advice Council in 2003 was a bit of a glitch in that, but it was one glitch and then they got back on track because everybody still respected the international order at this point. So another key thing in this, which is linked to it, is obviously these agreements and participation is supporting global alliances. And supporting global, actually institutions, let's put institutions, not alliances is true as well, but if we, institutions. So if they set up institutions globally to protect people's interests. Institutions. Can anybody think of a global institution? So it's an institution that functions as a means to, as a peacekeeping force, I guess, in the world. So we've got the UN, and connected to that, I guess, is NATO. So that's a military strategy. I guess UN is the nations working together after the Second World War to promote the interests of everyone. NATO is more of a military operation to defend countries under attack. Anything else? What about economic institutions? Anybody know any? What was that? WTO, yeah. What does that stand for? The World Trade Organization. So there was this understanding that we're going to try and trade with each other on a world level. So we'll make trade agreements with different countries. If you buy our oil, we'll sell you our bananas. And that's just an example. World Trade Organization and another economic organization, the International Monetary Fund, which kind of regulates the, I think, I'm not really an expert on that, but I'm assuming it's sort of a regulation of the stock markets and the currencies of the world, that we're going to try and have some cohesion on that level, that we're not going to see one country worth nothing. We're going to help each other economically. So there's a lot of institutions that were put in place that they supported and sustained and bought into. And it was reflecting a belief that US interests were best served by a stable, rules-based international system. So they basically followed a rules-based international system. So if they would come together at the Council of the UN and NATO, if they said, no, you're not doing that, we don't want you to do that to any country, and you've got the other countries would vote and decide, and people would comply with those rules. So there was an understanding that this America had global leadership by our century, economic, militarily, and morally. It was taken as a given, and in that leadership, they convened summits. So they basically promoted having people get together to talk, summits, promoting democracy and human rights, albeit selectively. So not always human rights is promoted, because they're also, what's the word, motivated by economic interests. So when they go and get involved in, say, somewhere like Iraq, if there's oil involved, we know there's underlying perhaps motivations for things that aren't always human rights. But generally speaking, they promoted democracy and human rights. and using their power to uphold a world favorable to Western values of equality and democracy. So what happened? So what we see happening then to change this liberal international order, what I might do is just write this under here, rules-based. Let's put these under here. So we've got more room on that side. IMF. So again, we see that there are unwritten rules in America's governance internally between the Democrats and Republicans. There's a way of behaving towards each other. And it's the same with these rule-based international cooperation, that they followed the rules. People followed the rules. International system. So now we're going to see that under Trump, basically this foreign policy of the USA has changed. So before it's this liberal international order, and then we get Trump. So what we need to see really is how the world has significantly changed under Trump, how America's significantly changed, and that's affecting the world. So after years of war, so what we see first happening is this public disaffection. So we're going to see public disaffection, which enables Trump as a populist to rise to power. After years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, American public appetite for intervention waned. So these are acts of intervention on the US to get involved in other countries' affairs to try and bring stability, supposedly, and peace in the world. And Americans are sick of it. They're thinking, we don't want to intervene anymore. This is costing us money. We're losing loads of Americans on foreign soil to these wars, and we're upset with it. There was rising domestic skepticism about free trade and globalization as manufacturing jobs declined. So as Americans started to lose jobs with the economic crisis, they said, we don't know about this, free trade and globalization and working with other nations and getting their goods. We need to promote American manufacturing because we're losing jobs. And frustration that some allies were not pulling their weight in defense. So they're saying, we're spending millions in defense in Ukraine. Why are we getting involved? Why can't Europe do more? So there's this, again, it's an economic crisis, and they're focused on America needs to conserve some money. So we don't want to send it to foreign wars. This discontent set the stage for Donald Trump's insurgent candidacy, which explicitly repudiated many elements of the foreign policy status quo. So this step set the stage for Trump to get in, and now he's going to destabilize all this, basically. Trump's worldview meant, so the title in this next section is America First Disruption and its Aftermath. So Trump's foreign policy was basically, instead of being a liberal international order, we're going to see MAGA. And what that means is America first. So we'll try and parallel what it says over here. So he begins to, Trump's worldview meant placing narrow US interests above traditional alliances and agreements and viewing international relations in zero-sum transactional terms. So what that means is that he really had no regard for previous alliances and agreements. He says, we're not doing that anymore. And international relations he's not bothered about. So he's not going to work diplomatically and to promote democracy. He's basically going to say, I'm going to do what I want. So he's got, because he's going to place US interests above everything else, or what he thinks is US interests first. And I guess diplomacy is agreements, disregarding previous alliances. So the second thing we've said is multilateral. What's Trump? Is he multilateral? No. What is he? Unilateral. So now we see this shift from multilateralism to unilateralism, which basically means acting for your own interests only, for one country's interests. So it's an action or decision made or affecting only one country and not agreed on by others. So there's not this spirit of cooperation and working together, that I'm just going to do what I want and no one can tell me differently. And we saw, obviously, this is kind of Bush's New World Order concept. He's going to cast aside global institutions. So and that's my wording for kind of summarizing what he's doing with global institutions. Which have been long recognized by US governments in the past. So nowhere was the shift more dramatic than in Trump's posture toward NATO and other allies. Trump openly questioned the value of alliances that past presidents had held and treated as sacrosanct, which means sacred. So past presidents had treated these organizations as sacred. And what that means is, with kind of like a holy reverence, you're not going to trample on them. You're not going to change it. You're going to stick by them and support them. And to change it is almost like unheard of, unholy. It's the wrong thing to do. Famously, he derided NATO as obsolete. So that's an example. E.g., he said NATO equals obsolete. So it's no longer fit for purpose. Its function is dead, basically. And he's highly critical of the amount of money that America sends and says, you have to start doing this yourself. Traditional allies from Europe to East Asia suddenly faced an American president who saw alliances as bargains to be haggled over, not as vital strategic partnerships. So he sees these alliances not as a partnership, which they were before, you know, the bipartisan spirit that they work together to establish world order. But he now begins to see these as almost like business arrangements. So I'm going to haggle and bargain with you till I get the best business deal out of this. It's not about looking at both our interests. It's about me getting what I want out of it. He withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, UNESCO, and the new UN Human Rights Council. So he withdraws from these organizations which traditionally have been there to preserve peace and human rights. And he halted funding to the World Health Organization in the midst of a pandemic. So we can see that he's cutting off all these institutions, even the World Health one, in the middle of a pandemic. Two significant changes as well in his foreign policy is how he treats other nations. So he begins to change the rules of interaction or engagement with these other countries. So I don't know if we put that under rules-based international system. Maybe we could put that here. Changes rules of engagement. And there's two primary examples of the way he changed foreign policy were Russia and China. So let's put examples: Russia and China. So just in summary, for Russia, US policy toward Moscow used to combine deterrence and diplomacy. So they were saying, we're not going to let you do certain things, but we're going to be diplomatic. We're going to sit down and talk with the Russian leader or with Putin. And US presidents, regardless of their party, whether they're Democrat or Republican, they usually spoke firmly against Russian aggression. So they were united in the fact that we were not going to let Russia step out of line, that if they're going to be aggressive, we're against it. But Trump's approach was startlingly different. So Trump's approach to Putin has been really up and down, which we've traced in this warfare between King of the North and South. It was marked by personal praise for Vladimir Putin and a reluctance to criticize Russia. So we see him in this kind of, neutral position and allowing Russian aggression, supporting Putin, but at the same time, there's a rhetoric of being against Russia. There's a very mixed signals that he's sending. And similar with China. So he took a much more confrontational line with China. So he's much more lenient with Russia than previous presidents, and he's much more confrontational than previous presidents with China. So they had trade agreements in place with China, and they kind of worked alongside China, even though China's got abysmal human rights record. But this, especially on trade, he launched a sweeping trade war against Beijing, slapping tariffs on everything. So this was huge tariffs placed on China. and he axed the Trans-Pacific Partnership on his third day in office. So there was a partnership arrangement with Asia and America that he totally slashed, a move widely seen as a self-inflicted blow to US strategic interests in Asia. So that basically meant that this was an inflicted wound on US interests in Asia. So before, US had quite a stable relationship with the Asian nations, and now this slashes their that stability, basically. So in summary then, Trump's rhetoric is very imperial. Does anyone know the difference between imperial and colonization? So colonialism is similar to imperialism, but there's a slight difference. Does anyone know the difference? So colonialism, we've said, is where a country goes in, takes over that nation, puts its own government in, purges the country of resources, and essentially, takes over the whole country and makes it theirs and part of their empire. I guess that's the British Empire. That's a way of building the empire. And an empire is an extensive group of states or countries ruled over by a single monarch, an oligarchy or a group of people, or a sovereign state. So the British Empire, they went into other countries and they wanted to extend their territory and build the empire. Very similar, I think, to previous nations like Babylon, Medo, Persia wanting this world dominion. Imperial basically means relating to an empire. So he wants to do the same thing. He's not using the same technique necessarily. So America's not marching into France and saying we're taking over, but he's using economic and military strength to flex muscle and to pull countries into line to make them do what he wants, so that he becomes the dominant player on the world field. So he's got this imperial mindset, which is basically unilateral. So we could put imperial in here, that he wants to make America the only superpower, basically, the world dominating power, instead of working together with these other nations, imperial. So now people thought he would be isolationist, which we discussed yesterday, that he's going to preserve America first. We're going to isolate ourselves, not work with other foreign nations, not intervene in their affairs. We're going to stay and make America great. But I think he's shocked people in the way that he's not doing that. He's not becoming isolationist, because we touched on this yesterday. When he reaches out and says, I'm going to make Panama and Greenland mine, he's intervening in a big way, aggressively. So he's interventionist. And it's basically a Trump form of interventionism and isolationism. He's reshaped what it looks like under Trumpism. So it's very much stamped with his character. So when he discusses taking back Canada, Panama Canal, or the Gulf of Mexico, this is a different America as it was in 1898. There's this shift now. He shifted it into becoming a superpower and not working together with other nations. So let's see what time to do this. So I want to just take some snippets of articles, because now at the end of the year, there's many newspapers which, if you had time, you might not at camp, been following end of year articles, basically summarizing what does the first year of Trump look like? What's he done and what's he achieved? So first of all, let's look at internally. I know we've been discussing foreign policy, but internally, what's he been doing? So this is taken from the New York Times article that was posted on the media broadcast from 16th of August, 2025. And it's when he took control of Washington, D.C.'s police force. So it says 4 takeaways from the week Trump took control of D.C. police force. So we've got this internal. Let's see what's happening internally. And then we'll go to externally. I don't know if you want so this is New York Times, 16th of August. 2025. And it's on the media broadcast if you go back to look. So basically what this says is, in a remarkable exertion of his power, President Trump has taken over the city police force and deployed the military to patrol the streets. And this is not really been done, becoming the first president in history to turn a city of 700,000 people into a laboratory or an experiment for what he describes as a crackdown on crime. It has put the federal government in the quotidian business of clearing homeless camps and monitoring nightlife, and left residents fearful and unsettled by questions like who can be stopped and for what, and who is in charge. So he basically sends the military in to control the police. So this is in DC, sends military in to control the police. And this crackdown on crime, people are sick of crime and they're kind of bought into that narrative that he comes in is going to sort crime out. But usually, I suppose, one of the ways to sort crime is maybe to give more funding to the police, not send the military in to control the police. So this is almost an act of martial law, even though he hasn't instituted martial law. And it's, I think the police are state run, and this is sending in federal troops. So this is now the federal government intervening in state affairs. So the four things from that is there was a palpable increase in federal law enforcement on the streets, but few details about the arrests they have made. So you've got federal law enforcement on the streets. Which didn't happen before. And there's no information about the arrests. So before, it's public that people get arrested and you can find out the details. People have rights when they're arrested to appeal to a lawyer. And now they've got no information about who's being arrested because it's a federal level. So the state doesn't have to know. I think that's the logic. The presence of the military was muted. So it's kind of played down in the press. This is not a big deal that the military is on the streets. Actually put that down. So when you mute someone, you keep it silent. So it's really made you know, they didn't talk about it, don't make it known in the press and stuff. It's kind of like underrated and underplayed. Trump officials appear to have an additional agenda item, immigration enforcement. So at the back of this is immigration enforcement. But this, in the past, this is not the way that people deal with immigrants. You don't send the military in to supposedly arrest illegal immigrants. There's due process of law to be followed. If someone wants to become an American citizen or has immigrated, even if it's illegal, there has to be process that's followed. And here they're trying to enforce it using the military. Officials in Washington grew increasingly defiant as protests popped up. So people began to protest. And leaders were defiant of this action. But what you see then is Trump steps up, leaders defiant. So, and we've seen this in other places, other cities of America, where the governor of the state says this is not right, we don't like this action, people are taking to the streets, and then Trump clamps down even heavier to stamp out the voice of dissent. So these are significant turning points, considering this is the center of the capital of the government, Washington, D.C., where Trump is now flexing muscle to show this is what's going to happen if you don't fall into line. So this is a very aggressive threat. So another thing we see is, this is from PBS, December 24th this year, so this is 3 days ago, tracking how much of Project 2025 the Trump administration achieved this year. So I'll just give you the article so you can read it too. So it's PBS, which is public, I can't remember what it stands for. You can have a look at it. 24th of December this year. So I won't bother to write all the details on the board because we don't have space anyway, but this is essentially Project 2025. So has everybody heard of Project 2025? Does everybody know what that is? Anyone doesn't know what that is? You may not want to put your hand up, but Project 2025 is essentially a document that was put together by Protestants to list the things they want to see in government to make America a Christian nation, basically to enforce far-right Christian ideology. It was denied when Trump was being elected that he knew anything about the document. He said he's not working with these people, but there were some things in the press to say he was working with the architects of this document. I think Elder Tabo did a presentation about the details in this document, if you want to go back and have a look, because it's quite lengthy. But essentially, it covers areas like human reproductive rights, religion in schools. So if we just quickly take a look at what he's done. So this document lays out several things they want the government to do to make America a Christian nation and to enforce its ideology. How much of that document do you think Trump has fulfilled since he got in the last year? What percent? Somebody just have a guess. So we know it's not 100%, but what percentage do we think it might be? He's denied doing any of it up to now, but I think. Go on, Sabina. Maybe 50%. 50%, that's what the article said. So it said that 50% of the goals in that document he has achieved in the past year, and that's just 1 year out of a 4-year term. So in the months leading up to his election, President Donald Trump insisted he had nothing to do with the far-right vision for his second administration, known as Project 2025, a Christian nationalist blueprint to remake the federal government. As the year draws to a close, a crowdsourced effort, as well as trackers from advocacy organizations and labor unions, show that his administration has implemented roughly half of the goals laid out in the document's 920 pages. So this is to change the federal government to make it far-right Christian nationalist, and he's achieved about 50% of the goals in this document, which is shocking, really. Project 2025 is rooted in injecting a narrower interpretation of gender, sexuality, and race in federal policy. It calls for ending nearly all of the US government's efforts to achieve equity, including the collection of data that could be used to track such outcomes across the public and private sector. So what he's done, he's cut funding to research organizations that are tracking equality or equity. How are people of different race and gender and sexuality being treated? Let's track that and see if we're improving or not. So he's just cut funding to that, so you can't track it anymore. It suggested eliminating diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. So we've probably all heard of DEI programs, which basically say that they have to employ so many people of a female, of different genders, different races, and positively promoting people being treated with equality. So he's cut those programs. It's also recommended removing out of every rule and regulation terms like sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, gender equity, gender awareness, along with abortion, reproductive health, and reproductive rights. So he wants to remove all those topics from federal government policies, which have all been there in the past. The blueprint also suggested transforming the FBI into a politically motivated entity, abolishing the Department of Education, and dismantling the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, which basically deals with climate change. The White House has made progress on all of these fronts. This is what 2025 says they want to see happen. The White House has made progress on all these fronts through a series of executive orders and also politically motivated hirings and firings and restructurings that have fundamentally expanded the president's influence and power across all branches of government. So we know that he fired federal workers and he put other people in place that were on his ideological framework, that he's changed the face of the federal government. He's given the FBI, he's forced the FBI to follow his policies and made it a political organization. And he's trying to destroy those two organizations, education and climate change, because he can see how much influence they can have on the culture. So here are some of the specifics of the Project 2025 that he's implemented and how they impact women and LGBTQ Americans. So essentially, this is showing us the erosion of human rights over the past year. And that obviously ties directly into our message. So on abortion and reproductive rights, Trump maintained throughout the 2024 campaign that if elected, his administration would leave the issue of abortion across to the states. But as of November 2025, this year, last month, his administration had implemented about 40% of the project's policies aimed at restricting reproductive freedoms, according to the Reproductive Freedom for All and Abortion Rights Group. So he has shifted 40% of the policies on abortion in different areas. So let me put this. So this is connected to internal. So this is about how he's acting on a military level, I guess. And then we've got the human rights issue. So there's several things, got no way to put it. Let's see. So this is the first thing is reproductive rights that he's affected. The second thing is LGBTQ rights. So Project 2025 called on the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC. So this is the Center of Disease Control, which oversees the health of the nation, I suppose, on one level, to stop collecting data on gender identity, and for the National Institutes of Health to fund studies into the negative side effects of gender-affirming care for transgender people. So far, these suggestions have largely played out. So they're basically destroying all rights for transgender people. And there's other things in the article. I just don't have time to put all the details of it, but essentially it's showing how it's affected LGBTQ rights. Education's changed. Both Project 2025's authors and President Trump have long expressed a desire to eliminate the Department of Education. While they do not have the authority to do that, they have taken active steps to weaken the agency, giving more decision-making control to the states and the school districts, and also influencing institutions like Harvard based on funding. If you don't do what we say, we're not going to support you, to change their policies. Primarily, I think this again is a human rights issue with education. Why does he want to eliminate the Department of Education? Anybody think of any reason why he'd want to do that? Surely he's pro-education. Why would he want to do that? What policies educated? I suppose there's one thing we saw in Florida. What happened in Florida with, what did they do? They banned books. Books about what? About teachings about race. So let's ban history books about slavery. Let's deny our slave-orientated past or our history of slavery, and rewrite the narrative that it really didn't happen like that, so that we can say that we are, that I guess it's promoting white supremacy. That's the bottom line. So it's destroying equality. And DEI initiatives in education. So teaching people to treat people properly without prejudice and bias. All those things are rooted in the education program, that we will embrace the DEI policies, and wants to destroy that narrative, because you have to, I think Hitler did the same, and Putin, you have to reshape history in order to go forward. You have to reframe people's view of the past in order to change the future. So it's connected to conspiracy theories. And they recognize that if people are educated, you can't win, because if you know the truth about something, it sets you free. We know the power of information and education, and that's what he wants to reset that. And the last area where where they had significant impact is on the military. And again, this is to do with human rights. We've seen the Pete Hegseth speech. We know that Pete Hegseth is aggressive. He wants to change. He's changed the Department of Defense to the Department of War, which is an active sign of aggression. And in that speech, he just blew away DEI policies. It was really anti-minority groups, LGBT, transgender in the military. So it says, under Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, the military has moved quickly to align itself with Project 2025's objectives, with an emphasis on reducing healthcare access for women and LGBTQ service members, an effort to overturn policies tied to DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. These changes have the potential to influence civilian policies down the line, in part because military policies reflect the values and strategic priorities of an administration and signal what might be coming to other federal departments. So the way that they treat people in the military, which is usually top notch, if you're in the military, it's a good job, because it reflects civilian policy. So what he's done in the military now is showing what they're going to do in civilian policy, which they're already doing, that this reduction of rights for everyone, basically, or that women and LGBTQ, and other federal departments will probably follow. So that's internally. So this is internal. So this is this section about how they're policing the streets, how they're eroding rights internally. So we know that externally, the policies of Trump are just going to reflect that internal behavior. So basically, you're going to use the rule of force and aggression. You're going to use the military to make people comply, and you're going to reduce all these rights. You're going to change the shape of these institutions. And so then when we go to external or foreign policy, we've basically already traced that down here, what Trump has done and how he's changed everything. I think I've just got one more quote as we finish up. I had thought we might have more time to look at biblical history in the light of this topic, but probably I'll pick that up for a Vespers class, hopefully. So this is the last article. It's Councils on Foreign Relations from December 19th. So I'll just put it here under the external. Councils on Foreign Relations. And this is December 19th, so that's last week, 19th, 2025. And I'm just going to read, I think it's 3 paragraphs, but they're very short. So December 19th, 2025, the Council on Foreign Relations, not councils, sorry, the Council on Foreign Relations, which you've probably heard of, is an institution. And this is what they're saying about Trump. When Trump was re-elected president last year, many Americans believed, for good reason, that he would chart an isolationist course for the country. So we have spoken about this, the isolationist, that he would take America to one side and try and make it great and not get too involved in everywhere else. Because he's focused on isolating America and making it great. But one of the biggest foreign policy surprises of 2025 might well be that 1 year into his term, Trump has not only eschewed isolationism, and eschew means deliberately avoided it or abstained from it, so he's not isolated America, but established a new brand of American internationalism with Trumpian characteristics. So now he's saying he's changed the shape of this international world order by making America face, and it has Trumpian characteristics. So we've seen that with everything he's done. Indeed, it's hard to be an isolationist and call for the acquisition of Panama Canal, Canada, and Greenland. That's nothing if it's not international engagement. So we can see that that's not isolationist, that's aggressively engaging on an international level. Nor does one earn a Nobel Peace Prize by sitting on the sidelines. Rather, Trump has taken credit or been personally involved in 9 international conflicts, including Gaza and Ukraine. So we could put that here, maybe as number 5, involved in 9 international crises. Or wars, I think you could say. International, conflicts, yeah. So involved in 9 international conflicts. Including Gaza and Ukraine. And the last paragraph, with nearly a year of foreign policy under this guidance behind us, however, it's now clear that Trump is no isolationist. So we know that. We know he was going to enter the glorious land and then Egypt. We know he's not going to stick to the glorious land. He wants Egypt. This isn't to say that he is a liberal internationalist like his Republican and Democrat predecessors who worked to strengthen international institutions, follow a rule-based system, and underscore the importance of international cooperation to address both national interests and transnational challenges. Far from it. Rather, he has recast internationalism in his own image, which I think is really interesting wording, because like we know that, let's put that here. So he has recast internationalism, what that looks like, this international world order, international, in his own image. So we can see almost biblical image, biblical narrative there, that this is in the Trump image, this is the image of the beast. So in summary then, that last paragraph, finishing off, it's basically saying that he is not liberal like previous presidents, that he's not working on these principles when he engages internationally. He's basically reformed everything in his image. So he's not strengthening international institutions, which we said before. He's actually casting them aside and weakening them or saying they're obsolete. He's not following the rules-based system of diplomacy and democracy. He's not engaging with discussion. And he's underscoring and not underscoring the importance of international cooperation to address national and transnational challenges. So he's not cooperating with people, basically. He's not working together. So he's created a partisan spirit on an international level. and in his own image. Let's pray. Our dear loving God, we thank you for giving us clarity on these often complex issues. Before, we knew nothing about politics. Well, some of us knew more, but most of us were not interested or didn't study them. And it's quite challenging to address these topics. But we pray that you can help us to simplify and to understand what this administration is doing and how the Seventh Kingdom is progressing on a world level, in the world field. Please continue to guide each one of us as we not only go through this Sabbath, but as we continue on this journey of truth. May you establish and settle us as a movement in our right understanding of the Seventh Kingdom and also your kingdom. We thank you now. We pray you'd continue to guide and direct us through the rest of the camp. In Jesus' name, amen.